Hi guys, it's Sophie. So I'm doing my January wrap up. There's a lot of books and I thought I would do it a little early. So there's a couple books I'm going to talk about that I'm pretty sure I'll finish today or tomorrow. And I'll share just my thoughts so far, just because I'm not going to get time to do this after work tomorrow with there being so many books. But I do have time to talk to you about it today. So I think let's start with magazines, because I read 3 magazines this month. I haven't read magazines in a little while, and I always include them in my reading because I like to track them and I think that they're fun to read. So I have 2 of them in physical form. You might be able to guess what the third one is. And the issue 1, which is no longer available in print, I read online. I bought the PDF for Sick Magazine issue 1. I've seen a few people talk about this magazine on BookTube, and one of Jen's pieces is in issue 3. Yeah, in issue 3. And I came across them when I was in Bookhouse in Bristol, and I was just really interested to pick them up and have a read, and it was the kind of thing that you wouldn't ever find where I live. So I read all 3. I read issue 1 and issue 2 whilst being up at night with struggling with sleep because of my serial pattern. It's something I'm kind of accepting now, that I only sleep properly every other night, and the other night's always a little bit tricky, but it's okay. It's like to a manageable level, and I really enjoyed it. I found it very comforting. The writing in here kind of crosses the experience of lots of different types of people who have some form of illness in their life that they're living with, and it also covers a variety of kind of genres of content. So if I look at issue 3, we have, for example, these artists in here and some of their pieces, and then we might have longer form essays that people include. We also have poetry. I'm just trying to find you some poetry. There's some poetry, and they're just really lovely produced items as well. To say they're only on issue 3 and they're only reliant on like funding for people buying them, I just feel like it's so well produced. It's got so slick, so quick, and I really enjoyed them. So it's definitely a magazine I'm going to keep purchasing. I will do so online. Just as I say, it's the kind of thing that we never have anywhere, probably in the whole county in which I live, but they are really good. So if you've been questioning it, I'd recommend. And then I'm going to go through fiction next. I have a lot of non-fiction this month. So I have Exit Management by Naomi Booth. This one was one of the few books I asked for from Dead Ink for Christmas, and I really enjoyed this one. I read it very fast. It's about a boy who ends up caring for an older man that he used to work for. He would rent out his house to other very wealthy individuals whilst the current inhabitant was away. But the man becomes very poorly, and he, in knowing him, ends up caring for him far more than would ever be needed in the context of his job. He meets a very vicious HR professional who specialises in ending, so redundancies, mergers, job loss. Basically, she tries to smooth over very difficult job loss. It seems as though she does it all within one company, and when I was reading it, I was like, what's happening in this company? But yes, so she's good at exits, and the 2 of these individuals collide. Their 2 worlds collide, and the very different personalities of them show through in this. It's a book that's looking at ambition, at greed, at the desire to hold and possess things, at sort of in a weird way, which was probably the only bit I didn't like, whether wealth has any worthiness to it. But yes, I did really enjoy it. Read it very fast. Another quick read was another one that I've seen in a few places, which is Mrs. Caliban by Rebecca Ingalls. This is about a woman who is a very dissatisfied housewife who lives with a very absent husband, who encounters a strange sort of aquatic amphibian-like man who is variety class as kind of part of a research project, maybe a terrorist, and she forms a relationship with him. It's just funny and very, very, very short, and looking at gender roles, patriarchy, and the way in which people assign themselves places within marriage and what might overturn that. But it's very funny, it's very short, so I think you'll like this one too. Next I have The Manningtree Witches, which I read, and you'll see me talking about a little bit in my reading vlog if you watched that one. I very much enjoyed this one. This follows a small town in England where a collection of local women are suspected to be dealing in witchcraft. I think the main draw to this book is the writing. I think the prose is just gorgeous, but I did think that the story pulled you into it too. I actually read it far slower because I was buddy reading it than I would have had I been reading it by myself, and I think this is one you could probably read in a day or two, or if you had a day off the day, or 2 days if you didn't, and it is very beautifully written. I think it's a daily novel. I think it is, but yes, it's very enjoyable, and I don't read an awful lot of historical fiction, so that it had to overcome that for me to enjoy it like I did. Next I read Night Shift, which was a story about a woman who becomes obsessed in some manner, whether it's romantic or platonic or something in between, we're never entirely sure of, but she becomes obsessed with a woman that she meets at her workplace and sees this woman as kind of the key to unlocking the boredom and the staleness of the life that she's made for herself, that she's been quite happy in up until she views this other life that could be possible to her. The principal kind of thing behind this book and the title is that she starts off working the day shift and swaps to the night shift, so completely kind of inverts her world. If you're into like messy females, anything about obsession or obsessive relationships, I definitely think you would enjoy this one. It made me kind of cringe throughout, not because the book was bad, but of just trying to direct the character to do something or anything else than what she kept deciding to do. Yeah, so that one is Night Shift. Then I picked up The Raptures by Jan Carson, which I enjoyed reading, but I definitely don't think was as much literary as it was just fiction, which is fine, but I often don't differentiate that, and I don't think this, I don't know, there was something about the book that felt very, very like I would have read it before I started reading literary fiction. And the book that's sitting next to me down here would be an example of it on the other side, but it didn't mean I didn't enjoy it. I really enjoyed it. I read it very fast. We follow a group of children and their parents who are living during the Troubles, and a mysterious illness begins to take out the children in one class, and we're kind of attached to the main character, who is the only person who doesn't fall ill when the children start becoming unwell. It was very enjoyable. It was very quick to kind of rattle through. It's not a life-changing book. It's one that I could see myself by the end of the year maybe passing on to someone else, but I really enjoyed the process of reading it. It's not to downplay that at all. I'm just not sure it will stick with me long term. Last, I finally got around to reading Paul by Daisy Lafarge, which is completely the other side of that literary scale. This looks at a young woman who is very naive, very docile, very you almost want to wrap her up because she seems so vulnerable to the whole wide world, who has, as part of her studies, moved to France and has had this relationship with an unnamed man in Paris that makes her just need to get away from that relationship. Part of me reading this book, by the way, and probably lots of other people, I wanted that book too. So did anyone else say like I want to read that book? And to get away from this scenario, she decides to go and help out on a number of sort of communal eco-sustainable farm projects. It's kind of like a volunteer app, and then you sign up and they send you to somewhere suitable. So she goes to this particular farm, and there's an older charismatic man who seems very similar to the man who she had escaped from in Paris, and falls underneath his spell. And we follow then the aftermath of this. I did definitely enjoy this book. This is, again, a little bit like Night Shift, but a little bit less. You're just kind of trying to make her make different decisions as you're reading the book, and at points she does make decisions which you're like, oh thank goodness, now let's see what happens, but she keeps making the wrong ones. So again, it's that kind of frustrating experience as a reader of following someone where you know they maybe ought not to go. But that one is Paul. And then 2 memoirs that I listened to an audiobook that I'm going to sneak in the middle, and I'm going to sneak them in the middle because of one book which I think lies a line that's quite interesting, which is What It Feels Like for a Girl by Paris Lees. This is non-fiction, it's a memoir of Paris Lees' life, but she has chosen to tell it as if she was describing it happening to someone else. She has sort of used, I don't know whether it's actually her own dead name, but used a male name for the protagonist of the book when they're younger, and it doesn't focus on the journey of her transitioning. It's more about the experiences that she'd had when she was young, and how she navigated her gender and her experience of her gender throughout that period of her life, and how that linked with assumptions people made about sexuality, the violence that was intrinsic to not being perceived as acting in the correct way for your gender, and just generally how kind of shit that can be, and the places that can drive people to. But it also shows a lot of joy in those experiences that she had when she was younger, and in those communities that she connected with and built for herself. But the reason I wanted to put it in the middle is because it's told as if it's a novel, and I think you could quite easily pick this book up, you know, if you've never heard anything about it or her at all, and read it as a novel. So I just thought that was interesting to pop in the middle. And then the other one that I had on audiobook was another memoir. It's My Mess is a Bit of a Life, and that was by Georgia Pritchett. I quite enjoyed this one, but it isn't one I'd buy like to keep in my stash, and I'm quite glad it was as short as it was. She is a comedy writer, and I'm really glad I listened to it in audiobook because that made the bits of the book that were funnier for me. I tend not to laugh an awful lot in the printed word. But as much as I can value her experience with anxiety and how that felt, and that kind of lifelong underlying creeping feeling of wrongness, it just wasn't something I was that interested in when I read it. And I know it's bad because it's memoirs, it's kind of saying I didn't find your life very interesting, but I just wasn't totally engaged with it the whole way through, and I actually ended up putting it on a slightly higher speed to be like, okay, like I know what we're doing, we'll go through it. I obviously wish her well and hope that she's feeling much better, but I just didn't love it. It didn't pull me in as some other memoirs have. Now on to other non-fiction. My battery's dying, so we might have to do part 2 of this, but I have Notes from No Man's Land by Ulla Bliss. This is a book thinking about race, talking about a very interesting collection of pieces to commence essays from in respect of race. Something that I'd read about before, but just as an example, was the experiments that were done with children in terms of providing them with black and white dolls, and then asking value judgments about those dolls, and seeing how whiteness and the white baby was kind of associated with goodness or attractiveness or worthiness, and then she'll jump into a conversation from there. The same with every one of her books I've read. I very much like her writing. I still don't understand why she's writing all of them, or it always feels like there's always something slightly odd about when I'm reading her, of feeling like something's slightly off about her being the narrator of the stories that she's telling, and this felt just the same. But it's still a really good book. I feel an unlocalized sense of discomfort about something about her writing, and I'm not sure what that is. And I think maybe a few years ago, if I was more naive, I maybe wouldn't have felt that at all, and would have completely just jumped in head first. So I'm not sure what that is, but I always love reading her, so I can still recommend it. Apologies, camera battery died as we suspected it would. So keeping going with non-fiction, I next have Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19 by Olani Chen and Matt Ridley. This is my favourite of 2 books that I read this month. So I'll talk about what I liked about this one, with caveating it first for both of them, that both of these books that I'm going to talk about, in fact I'll pull the other one out so that we can talk about them together. 2 seconds. This is The Other, This is What Really Happened in Wuhan, by Shari Markson. So both of these books look at a lab leak origin of COVID-19. And I want to caveat that before I do anything else by saying I still don't think a lab leak origin is the most viable explanation for how COVID came into being. But I'm reading a lot about viral illness at the minute, and there's a lot of content about COVID-19, and I wanted to read a little bit about what's behind that. I know that over recent months in late 2021 there's been a bit of a resurgence of saying actually they can't rule it out, but the overwhelming likelihood is that it would still be zoonotic transmission from animals. So before I get into either of these books, I just want to caveat that, because I think particularly the second one could potentially tie in with some other conspiracy theories, and I don't want to be adding to that. So Viral is a book which, not particularly cleverly, but definitely more softly than What Happened in Wuhan, talks about the difference between the 2 theories and the likelihood that one over the other occurs. The authors have a clear bias for the lab leak theory, but they invite the reader to make their own assumptions based on the facts that they're presenting. One of the elements that they talk about is geography, the geography of China and the geography of Wuhan itself. So the Wuhan market is just up here, the Hunan Sea Market, and this is the Wuhan Center for Disease Control. It's literally like across the street. And they talk a lot about the geography, the likelihood of a zoonotic leak appearing in Wuhan, where some of the factors which are more likely to increase their first appearance would be in southern China, and less likely to be in an urban centre with the particular virus that they're looking at. They go into lots of other aspects, but I found the geography part particularly interesting because it's not something I've read an awful lot about elsewhere. They go into things like how you would add or delete elements of a genomic sequence of a virus, and they talk a little bit about biosafety security levels of labs, and draw you towards a conclusion most certainly. And I think they do so really well. I think this is a good popular science book if you were interested in it, but I do think there's still an awful lot wrong with both of these books. I don't think that they paid enough attention in Viral, and it would have been such a better book if they had, to the reasons why it's honestly less likely that the lab leak had occurred, but to say actually it still tells us something about what it means for science and how we secure labs and the levels we might give certain viruses, and things like gain of function research, where you edit an existing animal virus to experiment to see how it might have pandemic potential, or how it might work if it affected humans, but they didn't do that. It was felt really one-sided, but in a sneaky but not particularly clever way. But I did actually really enjoy reading it. On the contrast, what really happened in Wuhan fell far more on the political spectrum than the scientific spectrum, and made very bold assertions about exactly what had happened. There was definitely throughout the whole of this book a assertion that anything that would have happened in China wouldn't have been shared because of the politics of the country and the secrecy that was seen in respect of SARS. And I do think that there are elements of how the Chinese government have shared information or not shared information which hasn't been particularly helpful for this cause, but I do worry this book holds more of an anti-China sentiment overall than something like Viral. And what I'd hoped for this book that it didn't really do was it mentioned in its description that it had a lot of first person accounts, it had interviews that hadn't been seen or heard before. I was really interested to understand if this was going to be more accounts from people in Wuhan about what the commencement of the pandemic had been like for them. It isn't. There's a few elements in there, but most of them are videos that are available on social media anyway, and more of it is I heard someone say who heard someone say in a political context than that. So I wouldn't really recommend this one of the two. I think Viral's the better book. Both of them have flaws, however. Then I read Blueberries. I'm a little disappointed with Blueberries, though I understand the hype. This is a book that is a collection of essays. It's one of those collection of essays where you kind of know you're just peeking into the author's head and having a look around, and they write beautifully, and they're really, really, really good fun to read. But I just find it quite forgettable in that unless I'm seeing more than just, oh, I can acknowledge that or I can experience that. I need to have something new for it to stick with me. This is a book you'll love if you just want to read some lovely writing and connect with someone that isn't you but have similar feelings to you, that kind of an essayist. But I would recommend this as maybe a library one rather than a buy one. It just didn't have lasting appeal for me. The next one I have is a book that's definitely not for everyone, so I will just caveat that before I lift it up. That one is King Kong Theory by Virginia Spentes. This is described as punk feminism, and it's specifically looking at all different types of sex, essentially. So we sort of hear about sex in terms of rape, sex in terms of power relationships within sexual encounters, and also about sex workers and how women relate with sex. And I would say a lot of it is quite funny. However, there's one piece of this book, which is why I'm saying it's maybe not for everyone, and it's not just because it's about sex, I'm kind of like whatever, but it's the part where they're talking about rape, and the individual within this book has suffered rape, so it's a valid experience and a valid way of managing that. But something that not all readers might appreciate is there's an assertion within one of the essays that rape is a condition for women to attain freedom, that it's something that we need to kind of accept the risk of to live a free life. And I didn't feel personally like triggered or anything by that, but I do think that could be a very tricky, very difficult thing for a lot of survivors to read, dependent on their own beliefs, their own amount of victim blaming they've had through that, or their own experience. So I wanted just to caveat with that, but I do think it's fierce and it's funny and it's short. I particularly like the elements around sex work. I think it's the kind of description of prostitution, the description of that world. I don't know when this was published because it feels like it maybe was not that recently. I think maybe it might have been quite recently. Yeah, there was something about this, I can't see when it's published, but there was something about the kind of punkness of it that isn't something that I hear a lot about in feminist circles. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I think you may well enjoy it, but I needed to caveat it with that because I do think that could be a really hard thing for some of the people who might want to read this book. There's a lot of books this month, I apologise. The next one is Just Us by Claudia Rankin. This talks about race and is just brilliant. It's just brilliant. It's so beautifully put together as well. I love this book. So throughout the book, it uses two things that are really clever that I want to show you. The first of which is we have tweets or images which relate to the essay that we're discussing throughout there. The other thing I think is absolutely fascinating about the way that it's put together as a book that references a lot of stuff, and I felt like, and it doesn't necessarily say it is, but I felt like this was done for white people that might have picked up the book, is throughout it, you see these little red dots? She'll say something. So she'll say something like, the inability of white people to see children other than white children as children is a reality that frankly leaves one hopeless about a change of attitudes regarding the perceived humanity of black people. So she'll say that. On the other page, she'll then describe the studies, the experiments, the quotes, anything to back up why she's said that within the book. And it leaves this whole page here every time for her to explore either some media about the page or some more ideas or references, I suppose, about what she's writing and about what she's saying. And I just think it was so beautifully put together. It's a very personal collection of essays as well. There's a lot of personal stories in here, as well as how she's relating to the environment she sees in the world and how she wants to understand whiteness and racism in the world that she's encountering just day to day. I mean, it's listed again, An American Conversation, as kind of the subtitle. I just think it's beautifully put together, and if you haven't read it yet, I would definitely recommend it. It's very, very, very readable, and just this extra little spice with what they've done with every other page, and that content just makes it a really, really enjoyable, very nourishing read. The next one, unfortunately, I didn't love because I've just been so effusive about some of the ones on this side, but this was Letters to My Weird Sisters on Autism and Feminism by Joanne Lindberg. I talked about this in my blog. The content I really liked, but the way it's been chosen to be written I didn't get on with at all. So she's writing this as letters to people in the past that she believes, had they been alive today, may have met the diagnostic criteria for autism. And the individuals that she chooses are Virginia Woolf, Adelheid Block, Frau V, and Katerina Kepler, only one of which I'd ever heard of before reading this. And she chooses to write to them directly as if they were able to receive it, and she's writing with the time which they lived in mind. And I think it was that caught something that just I didn't enjoy. So she's writing about them, trying to talk about how it's like, what it's like today, but in this odd sense of harking back to exactly what their experience was. So it felt like this odd mismatch of times and time travel that my brain just didn't like. But that said, I think other people will enjoy it. That's definitely a very personal thing. And when I was reading it, I was very aware that I was thinking this isn't really a valid reason to be not enjoying the book, but it was something that just grated on me. But I don't think it would on anyone else. I think it's just me. So that is that one. If you're interested in autism and feminism, or the two apart, you might well be interested in this one. Then last, for ones I've read, I have two books which are on infectious illness. The first one is Smallpox, The Death of the Disease, and this was by D.A. Henderson. I will say that this is not potentially for the average, it's for the average reader, but it's maybe not for not what I'd recommend if you're like starting to read about pandemic non-fiction, which I've started to read a lot about. This looks at the eradication efforts of smallpox. I really enjoyed it, but it is quite dry. That's probably the only way I can describe it. The activities that are going on are very exciting, but it's a lot about like the politics of intergovernmental organisations, resourcing problems, funding, as well as like access issues like transportation in some rural areas of different countries. And whilst I really enjoyed it, I just don't think it's like as pacey and like necessarily the one I'd start with. I did really enjoy it. I'm very glad I read it. I knew nothing about the eradication of smallpox, but it's not a pacey story. It is a kind of, this is what happened in this country, this is what we did to do this, these are the problems we came with, this is how we got around them. It was good fun, but yes, you'll know whether you're interested in this one or not. But it's not, if I was going to say, yay, read all the non-fiction about infectious disease, this wouldn't be the first one I'd point you to. And then the last one that I read in January in total is The Pale Rider by Laura Spinney. And this one looks at the 1918 Spanish flu. This is still not my favourite book that I've read on infectious disease from all my non-fiction shelves, but it is much more the kind of book I'd recommend to you if you wanted to read something and aren't sure where to start. I feel like the 1918 flu is something I was peripherally aware of before COVID, and during COVID was something that was discussed more as kind of a comparison factor and what we might be heading to. It's also the sort of event of illness that triggered a lot of the fiction that kind of came back into our bookshops, came back onto those tables about pandemics of the past, because it's the closest kind of not similarly sized, this was enormous, but similarly like generationally affecting event with infectious disease. So this book looks at sort of how Spanish flu spread from place to place and the impact it had on the countries and people who it touched. I did enjoy it, but it probably would have scratched an itch if I'd read it sooner on, but it didn't quite hit some of the earlier ones I'd read had. But if you are interested in Spanish flu, if it's something that you've read about through some of the fiction you've seen, I think this is probably a really, really good non-fiction to pair it with. I just think there's a few others I've read before that were like Spillover by David Quammen is my absolute favourite book that I've read on infectious disease, and I think that would be one I'd recommend if you're not interested in this specifically. But I think if you are, it's good. It's interesting and strangely wide-reaching, the impact that this one period of disease had on the whole wide world. Very quick break just for a sec to breathe. And I'm just going to show you quickly the two books I'm currently reading. I'm very nearly finished with one of them, and I probably won't carry them over into February. To wrap up, so 50 Sounds by Polly Barton. I only have 30 pages left, so I'm definitely going to finish this one. Is following a woman who moves to Japan after university in a quite kind of naive, not really sure what she's going to do when she gets there way, and ends up sort of falling in love with Japan and Japanese, like specifically like the language. And in this book she uses specific mnemonics in Japanese to head out each title and to explain her experience and explain the meaning of those words. I am definitely not a language geek. That isn't something that I find easy. I've always struggled with languages, and this book is one I'm having to read very slowly. It's just not a niche that I fall in, but it's not because I'm not enjoying it. I am enjoying it, I just need more processing time with it. So I've been reading this one over probably 3 weeks in little tiny chunks and bites. It's definitely, I think Hannah May said this on her channel, it's definitely not twee. It's not the kind of English doesn't have a word for this, but look at this amazing language that does. It is exploring in more depth what it's like to become fluent in another language, the process of trying to learn a language, which, as I said, for me, I don't get to any of this. I get to like, I can't learn the vocab book, and then I can't, my brain doesn't let me play with any other languages. But yes, I did enjoy what I've read so far. I can't imagine that's going to change by the end of the book. So that one is the one I'm currently reading. And then the other one I'm currently reading, which again, even though I'm newer into this one, I'm probably still not gonna pull it into February, is The Guest List by Lucy Foley. And I'm about 100 pages into this one. I bought this one because I read The Hunting Party and it was a very quick, very light, brainless experience for me. It's like mystery book, group of people go to an island, someone ends up dead, oh my god, who killed them, Agatha Christie type stuff. And I did enjoy The Hunting Party, and I'd seen this one reviewed in a negative way as it's just the same as The Hunting Party, but for me I was like, oh, that sounds great. Hunting Party Part 2 in a slightly different setting with slightly different characters. So I am reading this one, but it will be one that I'll read and probably wouldn't have that much to talk about when I finish it, I would expect anyway. But I enjoyed The Hunting Party. I'm sure I'll enjoy The Guest List. And that's everything. 20 minutes on here and however long I had on my camera, so that's been a long time. But hopefully you've enjoyed listening to it. I think next month, if I get to more than 10 books by midway, I need to do a part 1 and part 2. But I'll see you guys again soon in my next video, and look after yourselves until then. Bye!